Hey everybody, welcome to our series of learnings every day at 1 o'clock. This is a joint project between Alexander Muss High School in Israel and Jewish National Fund with our amazing Muss teachers coming each and every day teaching us different topics that they have been interested in. And today we are really excited to have Donnie Condell with us to teach us for the day. Just want to remind everybody that you are on mute. If you do have a question, you can chat at me or one of our co-hosts, and we'll be able to flag Donnie to answer your questions. Donnie was born and raised in Los Angeles. After high school, he came to Israel for a year and a half of yeshiva and decided to stay for good. He spent many years in informal education as a participant and later West Coast director of the Zionist Youth Group in Brak. He was also a camp counselor, an assistant director of Camp Mosheva, Wild Rose in Wisconsin. He holds a BA in political science and military strategy from Bar Ilan University and an MA in counterterrorism and homeland security from IDC Herzliya. He has worked as a journalist for both Israeli and American publications, and after a brief stint in the high-tech scene, found his passion, thank God for all of us, for teaching as a general studies teacher at AMHSI. He taught history, English literature, sociology, and psychology. In 2016, he was added to the Israel Studies staff and thrilled to share his passion for the people and the land of Israel with his students. He currently lives with his wife and his family in Mazkeret Batya. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Donnie Condell.
Greg, thank you very much. And it's really great to see so many people sign on, especially my alumni. I am a lot of my former students. It is awesome to see you guys. And I'm really excited that I get a chance to connect with you again. I also want to thank you guys, considering, Greg alluded to the circumstances of the last meeting. Thank you all for coming back and sending a message that we're not going to stop. And that actually helps me tie into my topic that I chose for today, because I was trying to think about the types of things that I can talk about in a time where, let's be honest, a lot of people are anxious, a lot of people are down, and at first glance, talking about the Shoah, talking about the Holocaust is not readily the one that's going to uplift us the most. But there's a really interesting saying in Judaism that I've been thinking about a lot lately, called Maaseh Avot Siman Labanim. Right, the actions of our forefathers is meant to be a sign for the children. And while no two problems that people or peoples or the world is going through are alike, there are always lessons that we can learn from stories of the past, struggles of the past, and the triumphs within these struggles that may be able to be applicable to our current situation. So I chose this particularly because we are living currently in a world that is feeling a little bit dark, right, with Corona and all that it entails, and us staying at home. Some of us can feel a little bit boxed in and down and worried. And in addition, and just tying into what happened last class, we are unfortunately living in a world where anti-Semitism still is very much a part of our reality. And what I wanted to talk about today was in a time where the world was incredibly dark, World War II and the Holocaust, how just a few people, and trust me, there are more stories, I'm sure there are, but I chose just three of the stories that are the most, they impacted me the most, that have helped me find little rays of light in times of darkness. And for us to be able to see that the Jewish mission of being an Or LeGoyim, right, to be a light into the nations, is especially important when everything around us is dark. Okay, so Greg will share this screen in a second, and we will get started with the first of these three stories. Okay, great. So the first of the three stories that I want to share today is the story of Ovadia and Eliza Baruch. All right, so next slide. Okay, so Ovadia and Eliza Baruch, I want to start the story by talking about Ovadia. Okay, so one more slide, Greg. Ovadia Baruch was born in a town in Greece called Thessaloniki, right over there. The Jews used to refer to it as Salonika, because the Jews have to give everything a different name. That is where he was born and raised in 1922. Now, I don't know how many people know this, because when we think about the Holocaust, we usually think about Jews coming from from Western Europe, and even a little bit Eastern Europe, but definitely Greece is not usually one of the places that you think about. However, Greece was actually one of the first places that the Nazis invaded. The Nazis had been eyeing the Jews of Greece all the way since 1937. Unfortunately, Greece is actually going to lose 81% of all its Jews in the Holocaust. And so in 1943, the Nazis are going to march into Salonika, and they are going to round up the Jews and deport them to Auschwitz. So Ovadia Baruch was one of the Jews sent to Auschwitz in that roundup in 1943, and he never, unfortunately, saw his family again. Now, this was before Auschwitz II-Birkenau was built, so the prisoners were being held in Auschwitz I, and that was not a death camp as of yet. It was primarily a labor camp, although, of course, people died. Now, the thing is that a lot of, say, Polish and German Jews, a lot of the other European Jews, were able to sometimes get by in really tough situations in concentration and death camps, because at least they could understand, if not speak, the language, right? So the Nazis were yelling in German, and if you're a Jew who spoke Yiddish, you could probably do okay, understanding the commands at least, and even better if you spoke German, and many of these Jews did. The problem was that the Jews from Greece didn't really have this background, and so they didn't understand anything the Nazis were telling them, and unfortunately that led to them having a much harder time than many of the other prisoners, which is saying something, obviously. Now, so when the Jews from Greece arrive in Auschwitz, things go south pretty quickly. Ovadia Baruch is selected for labor, but he is struggling to understand anything the Nazis are telling him to do, and he is suffering beatings at the hands of the Nazis day in and day out. And obviously, he is also being starved among all his other friends from Greece. And so he decides one night that he's going to sneak to the back of the kitchen and try and steal a little bit of soup that may be left over to try and bring back to his barrack to share with him and his friends. Unfortunately, he is almost immediately cut, and he is brought into a special room in Auschwitz I for a beating. And at this point, he is beat pretty hard, and he is going to scream out in his native tongue, which was Ladino, which is the Spanish version of Yiddish. It's Spanish and Hebrew together, and he is going to scream out in Ladino, "Ho madre," right? "Oh mother." Now, what he didn't know was that there was another person, a young girl, she was 17 at the time, who was in the room next to him, and she heard him scream out in Ladino, and she too happened to be from Salonika. They didn't know each other, but she heard this voice in her native tongue, and something, she says, unlocked in her soul. Something she heard, and she said, you know what? I need to get a message to this person who's screaming out in pain, and let him know that I'm thinking about him. Let him know that I'm with him. I don't want this person to give up. That girl's name was Eliza Tsarfati. So Eliza somehow manages to get a note past him telling him everything she wanted to say. My name's Eliza. I also speak Ladino. I'm from Salonika. She didn't know where he was from. I want you to know that I'm thinking about you. They begin passing notes back and forth, and they even manage to meet face-to-face 3 times while in Auschwitz. After 3 weeks of passing notes, Ovadia is going to write a note that he had no idea at the time would be the final note he'd be able to pass to her. But he wrote, "If God somehow allows us to survive this camp, I am going to marry you." Okay? Shortly after passing on that note, the Nazis the Nazi war is failing, and the Nazis themselves are going to start dismantling Auschwitz and moving people out to try and move them along further away from the front lines of the war, and that is going to be when we have the notorious death marches. In January of 1945, Ovadia is taken on a death march He is going to be on a death march from Poland to Germany. He's going to be on a death march for 5 months, where he is going to miraculously survive, eventually be liberated, found by 2 American soldiers, and brought back to a hospital for recuperation. Once Ovadia was healthy enough to be released, he decided to return to his native Salonika. Okay? Now, Greece had been bombed during the war, and so most of the Jews that had returned to Salonika were living in the synagogue all together as refugees. Every day, they would post a list of newest people that they found out had survived the war from Salonika and posted up on the wall. And you can believe that every single day, Ovadia went to the list and looked for Eliza's name. Now, what happened to Eliza? Let's go back to Greg. It's 2 more slides. Sorry. Eliza was in Auschwitz I for another reason. Eliza had the unfortunate fate of being chosen by the infamous Dr. Karl Klauberg. Most people know the name Mengele, right? Dr. Mengele. Karl Klauberg was also a horrible doctor in Auschwitz, but he had a specialty. He specialized in figuring out how to sterilize Jewish women so that they could not have children. And so Eliza was housed where most of the medical experiments took place, in the infamous Block 10 in Auschwitz I. Greg, one more slide. So this is Block 10 in Auschwitz I. So Eliza had been selected for experimentation, and Klauberg decided that one night he was going to take her on the operating table and have her ovaries removed. Now, the Nazis didn't like to get their hands dirty all that much themselves. They especially didn't like to touch Jews, so they often found other Jews to perform the dirty work for them. So there was a doctor named Shulman. Dr. Shulman, we don't know that much about him. Unfortunately, I'll tell you in a minute, he did not survive. But Dr. Shulman is the Jewish doctor who is chosen by Klauberg to perform these experiments on the Jewish women. And so Eliza is put on the table, of course, no anesthetic, nothing like that. And the surgery to remove her ovaries begins. Shulman is operating on her. And as the surgery is going on, there's an air raid siren from above. Klauberg, the Nazi, immediately starts to head for cover, but yells back to Shulman that he should stay and finish the surgery. Klauberg leaves, and Shulman continues the surgery, fearing for his life if anyone should come in and see that he had stopped. Shulman is working on Eliza there on the table when the air raid siren stops, and a few minutes later, he can hear Klauberg heading towards the room. At the very same time, Shulman is sewing Eliza up, and he whispers something in her ear. He says, "Listen, you're never going to see me again, but one day you're going to get a gift from me." Now, Eliza thought he was crazy. What, get a gift from him? One day? I mean, she'd just been operated on in Auschwitz. What's one day? She doesn't know if she's going to make it till tomorrow. And she basically had no idea what he was talking about and didn't give it another thought. And she was also delirious from the pain. Amazingly, she's going to survive the surgery. She's going to survive Auschwitz, and she too is going to survive the death march and eventually make her way back to Salonika. And so one day Baruch goes to the boards in the synagogue, and there he sees Eliza's name, and he can't believe it. He immediately makes arrangements to get her back to Salonika, to meet her, to talk to her, and of course, to marry her. And so Eliza gets back to Salonika. They meet, they embrace, they cry, they reunite, and to Baruch's surprise, she suggests that maybe they should date first. Okay. Baruch decides he can do that. You know, maybe they should get to know each other. They only saw each other 3 times in their whole life, and they decided they're going to date. So they begin dating, and look, Baruch never backed off from his grand idea that this was meant to be and he needs to marry her. And so after about a week of dating, he proposes again. But Lisa says no. And Baruch is shocked, but he doesn't say anything at the time. And he just continues to date her, and they hang out for a couple more weeks, and they have more talks, and Baruch proposes again. And Eliza says no. And a couple of times she is going to reject his proposal until he can't take it anymore. And he says, listen, Eliza, I don't understand. We've been dating this whole long time. I made a promise to you a long time ago. Let's get married. And she just looked at him. She said, I'm sorry, Baruch, but I'm sure that you want children. And I need you to know that I can't have. I was operated on in Auschwitz. I don't have ovaries and I cannot have children. Baruch was shocked for a second. Shocked that she would let this stop them from getting married. And he told her, listen, we will figure that out together. Children, no children. I want to be with you. And so the two of them get married. They have to make illegal aliyah bet to Palestine past the British blockade. They're going to make it on a fishing boat. Makes it even more difficult. They're going to settle in a town that many of you are familiar with. It's a town called Hod Sharon. Yeah. And they're going to set up a new life there. One day, Eliza is not feeling well at all. And when survivors get sick, people get nervous, rightfully so. And so she rushes to the doctor. And she goes to the doctor and she says, doctor, I don't know what's going on with me, but I really haven't felt well these last few days. The doctor takes a look at her, giant smile on his face. He says, Eliza, of course, you're pregnant. She says, no, you don't understand. I can't be pregnant. I was operated on. I don't have ovaries. He goes, no, Eliza, you don't understand. Here, come take a look at your ultrasound. And he shows her the picture and he says, well, I see you actually do have an ovary, but did you know you're missing your appendix? It turns out that during the air raid siren, while Cloudberg was heading for cover, Dr. Schulman removed the appendix instead of the ovary. That gift that he promised Eliza she would get one day from him turned out to be her son. Ovadia and Eliza had a son. Greg, I think it's the next picture. Sorry, two more. That's Ovadia, Eliza, and their son. They're later going to have a daughter. At last count, and I was only able to track down all the way till 2002, so the number is larger, but at last count, they had 5 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. Now, where's the light in this story? The truth is, it's in a lot of places. Eliza hearing a voice from home, wanting to reach out. Ovadia, by the way, sneaking out to feed not just himself, but his friends and risk his life for it. Dr. Schulman, who we later found out was killed by the Nazis because it was discovered that he was sabotaging sterilization operations. Amazing, tremendous moments of light in the darkest place on earth. And that's one story. The second story I wanted to share with you is the story of Joseph and Rebecca Bau. The next slide. Joseph Bau was born in 1920 in Krakow. He was a tremendously skilled artist at a very young age and decided very, very early on that he was going to study to be a professional artist. And he enlisted in the the School of Fine Arts in Krakow as a teen. One day, completely random, one day, his teacher says, by the way, if anybody is interested in learning Gothic font, I'm offering a class during lunchtime, completely optional. The only person to show up to that optional class was Joseph Bau. Greg, sorry, 2 more slides. That is the Gothic font, for people who aren't familiar with it. And Bau is going to become a master at Gothic font. Now, this is going to end up saving his life because Joseph Bau was still in Krakow when the Nazis closed it and turned it into a ghetto. The truth is that Bau was actually outside the ghetto when they closed it, and he had to sneak back in, which meant he had no ration cards, no ability to make money, and no ability to feed himself. And so, desperate to make money, he put a sign out in front of his house asking anybody if they needed any graphic work done, and in one of the sentences, he used the Gothic font. A few nights later, there's a knock on his door. He opens the door, and it's a Nazi. And he thinks it's been discovered that he snuck into the ghetto without papers. But he opens the door, And the Nazi simply asks him, do you think you can make signs and maps with Gothic font? He now has a job that will save the lives of him and his family. Now, that's a pretty amazing coincidence in and of itself. The work obviously was not great. Greg, if you go to the next slide, they had him making signs for the ghetto, but of course other things like the Jew is your enemy, Jews like lice, typhus, and plagues, and other anti-Semitic propaganda that he was promoting as well. And that was his work, but it saved his life. Like most of the Jews from the Krakow ghetto, Joseph Bau is eventually going to be transferred to Plaszow concentration camp. The notorious camp that you guys may have become familiar with through Schindler's List, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. Now, in Plaszow, most of Joseph's other family, his father, his younger brother, and his mother eventually transferred elsewhere, but was there, are killed, but he survives. And then this unbelievable, and when I say unbelievable, I mean unbelievable story takes place. Word gets to the commandant of Auschwitz, the infamous Amon Getz, that there is a Jew who can make blueprints and write in Gothic font. And so Joseph Bau is hired to work personally for Amon Getz. Now, what's his job? His job is basically to make different blueprints of Plaszow. Greg, if you go one more slide. In fact, if you were my student and you went with me to Poland, you've been to Plaszow and you know that it's simply a park now. It's just a grassy field. The only reason we know what Plaszow looks like is because of Joseph Bau. So he goes to work making blueprints. One day, Amon Getz comes to Joseph Bau and says, I need this blueprint by the end of the day. Now, in our day and age, it's pretty hard to understand how this worked, but it used to be that the copies of the blueprints were made on a special piece of paper that you drew on, and then the picture was developed by holding it up to the sun, right? Thank God we've moved on, we have Zoom now. But back in those days, the best technology they had was sun printing. And Joseph Bau looks out the window, and he sees that it's a cloudy day with no sun. Oh, it's Poland, come on. And he knows he's in trouble, because everybody knows that if Amon Getz doesn't get what he wants, he will kill you without hesitation. Amon Getz had no problem killing Jews for the smallest infractions. And so Bau knows he's in trouble, but he figures all he can do is try. And so he goes out, he takes his copy of the map, and he stands there for as long as he can, holding up this paper to the sun, praying that it will work. While he's standing there, another Jewish female prisoner walks by him. Her name was Rebecca Tenenbaum. She takes a look at Bau and says, what on earth are you doing? And even in this darkness, Joseph Bau, who considered himself a ladies' man, decided this was his chance to flirt. And so he says, well, you see, I'm holding this paper up to the sun, hoping that it'll get developed, but there is no sun. And he takes the paper and he puts it right in front of Rebecca's face. And he says, perhaps you can be my son. She giggles, she moves on. And he thinks that's the end of it. He thinks he's going back to Amon Getz now, and he's going to get, at best, a beating, and at worst, the end of his life. He hands in the blueprint. He gives it to Amon Getz, and to his unbelievable astonishment, the map came out. And now Bau's in shock, and he decides there must be something special about this Rebecca. I need to see her again. The very next day, he's going to risk his life when the guards aren't looking to run to a nearby field and steal some flowers that he's going to hide in his jacket till the next time he sees her. And he's going to give them to him, give them to her. They see each other back and forth. In a minute, I'll tell you what she was doing in the offices of Amon Getz, but she was there. And every once in a while, they would talk. And they decided they would come up with a secret whistle, a song, a tune that they would whistle to each other at the end of the day when the men and the women in the camps who were held separately would pass each other at the end of the workday. They would whistle to each other to let them know that they had both survived the day. And so day after day, they walk by and they whistle and they let them know that they are each other okay. And in the few precious moments that they are able to meet each other, they do. As crazy as it sounds, in Plashav, the two fall in love. But for Joseph Bao, nothing is too crazy. And he decides it's not enough to fall in love. He decides he wants to marry Rebecca right there in the camp. And so here's what he does. He proposes. She thinks he's crazy. He pushes. She thinks he's still crazy. Eventually, he wears her down. He saves up 4 loaves of bread to trade for 1 spoon. He then saves up 4 more loaves of bread and trades it to have a silversmith melt down that spoon and turn it into a ring. And then, one night, he's going to smuggle himself into the women's section of the camp. Greg, if you go 2 slides forward, I don't know how many of you remember or have seen Schindler's List, but there's actually a scene of this wedding in the movie. One more slide. If this works, Greg, you can try and click on it and see if the YouTube video, no, back one. Click on the picture and see if it, see if we can get the video to play. If not, that's fine, but, no. Okay, so you have a picture of it. It doesn't,
yep.
The video doesn't have to work. You can watch it another time. This is the scene from Schindler's List of the wedding happening in the barracks. As you can see, it is actually Joseph Bao's mother who was in the barrack with Rebecca, who officiates the wedding. Joseph Bao later joked that they were ahead of their time, the first female woman to officiate a Jewish wedding, right there in Plashaw. And so they decide to have this underground wedding at night. Shortly after the wedding is over, a siren goes off in Plashaw. 2 other men the very same night had escaped, and the Nazis were looking everywhere for them. Joseph Bao hops on a barrack in the women's barracks. He's hidden by his new wife and 2 friends, and somehow goes undetected. Eventually, the other 2 men who had escaped were caught, unfortunately executed, and the manhunt was called off. But now Joseph Bao still has to figure out how he's going to get himself back to the men's section for the night. He eventually sneaks out of the barracks and arrives just before running into an electric fence. And he doesn't know what to do. He said, listen, I don't know what to do anymore. At this point, I've resolved myself. It's awful that my new bride is going to be a widow before she even really got to enjoy it. But he takes a running hop and he jumps on the fence and he doesn't clear it. He said his feet hit the fence and he does not know to this day why the fence did not electrocute him. Somehow he survives the jump, sneaks back into his barracks and goes to sleep. Just a few days later, he gets some unbelievably unexpected news. Joseph Bao has been selected to go work for a man named Oskar Schindler. He's been placed on Schindler's List. So, he is now separated from Rebecca. He doesn't know what has become of her. And he is going to live out the rest of the war working for Oskar Schindler. In addition to doing his regular duties, he's also going to use his artistic abilities to create fake documents to help Jews sneak out of ghettos, camps, countries, all kinds of forgeries that he could use. At one point, someone asked him, Joseph, why don't you make fake papers for yourself? And he blankly looked at them and said, but then who would do this for all the others? That was Joseph Bao. He survives the war. He reunites with Rebecca, which is a whole nother story that would take 3 Zoom calls, and I'm not going to go into it now, but it is another amazing story. They decide to get married for real now. They go to the courthouse in Krakow. They got married on the 13th of the month, and it was a Friday. And the clerk at the Krakow County office looks at them and says, who gets married on Friday the 13th? Don't you know that's bad luck? They just laughed. Joseph Bao, in his interesting sense of humor as well. Greg, if you go one more slide, hated that he didn't have a wedding photo from his first wedding. And so using his artwork, took the wedding photo from the right and decided to make a wedding photo on the left as well. Now, Joseph Bao is going to move on to become one of the premier artists in all of Israel. A lot of people refer to him as the Walt Disney of Israel. But if that were all he did, that would be amazing. But it isn't. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about how he found himself on Schindler's List. After the movie Schindler's List came out, there was a huge media tour. And lots of the people portrayed in the movie, the real life people, were interviewed by the media. And so Joseph and Rebecca were interviewed by an American news station about the movie. And so a question that Joseph had never really considered before is posed to him during this interview. And the interviewer says, you know, Joseph, by the way, how did you end up on Schindler's List? And he says, you know, I never found out. I don't know. And Rebecca has this smile on her face. And he looks at her and he's like, what? She goes, well, I guess it's time I told you. It turns out that Rebecca had become Amon Getz's manicurist, another incredibly dangerous job. If you could hurt him, that could be the end of your life. Rebecca becomes his manicurist, and she hears things because she's close to him. And she finds out that Amon Getz's secretary had a mother in the camp who was about to be killed. And Rebecca rushes to the secretary and tells the secretary, and the secretary is able to save her own mother's life. And because of that, she feels like she owes Rebecca. And so the secretary is going to be the woman tasked with writing the names for Schindler's List. And as a thank you, she's going to put Rebecca on the list. When Rebecca found out, she approached the secretary and said, listen, I'm strong. I'm healthy. I'm resourceful. I can survive whatever comes next. Please take my name off and put Joseph's on. And that's how Joseph ended up on Schindler's List, and he never knew it until that day in the 90s. Rebecca survived Auschwitz because she took herself off that list. But she was right. She was strong, and she survived. As I said, Joseph went on to have a pretty successful career after making Aliyah and moving to Israel. He is going to create many of the fonts for Israel's earliest movies. If any of you are familiar with the classic Israeli movie, Greg, 2 more slides, I believe. Salach Shabati. Oh, we lost the PowerPoint, that's okay. 2 more slides. That's Joseph. Salach Shabati, so that text on the left is, the font is created by Joseph Bao. The font on the right as well as the screenshot from Salach Shabati, but I want you to notice on the bottom left corner, a strange little symbol. I'll talk about that in a second, but before that, I just wanted to point one other thing out that I found out doing research for this session. Greg, if you go 1 more slide, I was trying to find pictures of the Bao family, and so I was searching Rivka Bao in Hebrew, Rivka Bao, and every time I was searching, instead of pictures of people showing up, I kept seeing this thing on the right, Rivka Bao. I kept saying her name in Hebrew in this font all over the place, and it was driving me crazy until I realized the man who invented most of the fonts for Hebrew named one after his wife. And so that font is called Rivka Bao font. I think that's pretty amazing and really, really romantic and kind of cool. And I just found that out looking for pictures of the family. So I thought that was really nice. Sorry, 1 more slide, Greg, and I want to talk about that weird signature in the bottom left corner. This was Joseph Bao's signature for a very long time. And honestly, his family didn't know why. They couldn't figure it out. Now, it used to look the way it looked on the left. But if you look on the right, it's what happens when you turn the signature sideways, and it says in Hebrew, Bet Aleph Vav, Bao. So why the secrecy? His family had no idea why he was so secretive about his work. Unfortunately, in 2002, Joseph Bao is going to pass away. At his funeral, all of these dignitaries and members of the Mossad and all these people show up to his funeral, and his 2 daughters are completely confused. How on earth did you know my father? Well, did you ever notice that your father could sometimes be secretive? I said, yes. said, well, it just so happens that he was working for the Mossad as well. Joseph Bau was the Mossad's chief forger. That included creating the fake Syrian documents for Israel's super spy, Eli Cohen in Damascus, and the fake passports used by the Mossad agents in Argentina who kidnapped Adolf Eichmann and brought him to Israel for trial. And Joseph Bau had a hand in that as well. Again, so many rays of light. Love in a concentration camp. Sacrifice of Rebecca to put him on Schindler's List. His dedication after the war to saving Jews, protecting Jews, giving back to the state of Israel, giving back to the Jewish people. His positive attitude through the worst situations. They may be gone, Joseph and Rebecca, but their light from the darkness radiates, and I can feel it still today. And that leaves us with one last story. Greg, we have one slide. This is the story of Olga and Pearl Gluck. Olga is on the right side, circled in yellow. Pearl is on the left side. Sisters born in the town called Sulush in the Carpathian Mountains. It was then Czechoslovakia, now Ukraine. Olga was the older sister, taller, broader, healthy. Pearl was the younger sister, always frail, weak, and sickly. As Olga got older, she decided that she had to move to Budapest to go find work. She moved in with an aunt and became an apprentice for a seamstress. It was then that she was separated from the sister she loved so much. As the Nazis slowly made their way into Czechoslovakia, Olga had no idea what had happened to the rest of her family. Eventually, she was rounded up as well in Budapest and sent to a labor camp. The first thing she did when she arrived at the labor camp was look for somebody, a familiar face from her hometown or from her area, possibly to try and find out what happened to her family and especially what happened to her sister Pearl. She just wanted to know what happened to Pearl. Is she here? But Pearl wasn't there. Olga's going to do some back-breaking labor and eventually get transferred to another camp. And when she gets at that camp again, has anybody seen my sister Pearl? Pearl Gluck, is she here? Pearl Gluck from Sulish, is she here? No luck. Camp to camp, Olga's transferred and she doesn't know what's happened to her family. Until unfortunately, in 1944, Olga is transferred to Birkenau. Because of her strength and her health, she's selected for work, survives the selection, goes into processing, and is assigned a barrack. After going to her barrack, she sees what she can't believe, a familiar face from her town, a woman named Magda. And Magda runs up to Olga and says, Olga, you're never going to believe this. And Olga, by the way, had no plan of asking about Pearl at this point because, look, she hasn't found her for months. If Pearl did somehow manage to get transferred to Auschwitz, sickly, weak Pearl was never going to be able to survive it. But Magda runs up to her and says, Olga, you won't believe it. Your sister Pearl is here, and she's alive. And Olga just starts crying. She decides she has to see her. She goes to see Pearl, and she immediately sees that things are not good. She's weak. She's close to giving up. She's sick. And she immediately determines that she's going to take Pearl under her wing and protect her and keep her alive in Auschwitz. Not an easy task. And so her and a few friends save up some bread and bribe one of the capos to have Pearl transferred into her barrack, but there's a problem. Pearl's been in Auschwitz much longer than Olga has. And so it would be obvious that she doesn't belong in the barrack with the new people because her hair had begun to grow back. And so Olga has to get some more bread and trade that for a pair of scissors so that they can cut Pearl's hair and make her seem like she's a new arrival as well. Olga still doesn't really understand how Pearl even survived the selection. And the truth is, Pearl didn't either. Pearl arrived at Auschwitz and because of her stature was immediately placed in the line for death. At the very last minute, she decided she was going to make a run for it and ran into the other line. And she said afterwards, it must have been that God closed the eyes of all of the Nazis because not a single person said a thing. and she survived the selection. But as I said, she wasn't in good shape. Olga made sure that Pearl was chosen for work detail every day because she knew that's how you survived. They would only let Pearl stand next to skinnier girls so that by comparison, she wouldn't look so weak and frail. A few minutes before the Nazis came, they would slap her cheeks vigorously so that she'd have color rush to her cheeks and she would look vibrant. And once she was selected for work, she would then, her and her friends would not just do their own labor, but they would pick up some of Pearl's labor as well so that Pearl could rest and recuperate. It's not easy. It's dangerous. Olga is even going to risk her life a number of times to sneak into the kitchen and smuggle some potato skins back to the barracks to get Pearl a little bit more sustenance and keep her alive. They just barely make it out. They survive Auschwitz. They survive a death march, sometimes with Olga having to carry her over her shoulder. They once ran into the Russian army, who could oftentimes be just as bad, if not worse, as the Nazis. And one of the soldiers had set his eyes on Pearl until Olga unleashed a tirade in fluent Russian against him, scaring him away and saving her sister yet again. From the time that they were reunited in Auschwitz until Olga's death in 2006, the two were essentially never apart for more than a few months the rest of their lives. Greg, can we have one more slide? That's Olga on the left, Pearl on the right. That's their two other brothers who survived the war in the picture on the far right. They decide, the two of them, eventually, it takes some doing, but they eventually settle in Los Angeles. Olga is going to have two sons and a daughter, and that daughter is going to have a son. Greg, one more slide. I am that son. Olga is my grandmother, and Pearl is my great aunt. When we got Zoom bombed the other day, there wasn't a second in my mind where I considered not trying to do this talk again. Not the grandson of Olga Kluck-Hershkovitz. Not the person whose whole life was this shining ray of light in the darkness. And so, you know, Pesach is coming up, Passover, the 8th plague, darkness. And it was the Egyptians who couldn't see and the Jews who could, as if it were light. And I think that's not just a plague, but a mandate, a message, a commandment to each and every one of us to be the light in darkness. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Joining me. It was so great being able to talk to you guys again. I hope you have an amazing Chag Kasher V'Sameach, healthy, happy Pesach. And I hope to see all of you and speak to you all again very, very soon.
Donnie, thank you for those stories. Thank you for sharing your story. Maybe your students have heard the story before, but for those of you who have not, thank you. The chat is locked, so we are open. I've opened up the chat if people have questions. But I just want to say how powerful it was to listen and to be a part of that, and then ultimately for you to share so powerfully your story. And I couldn't agree more about that. There wasn't a doubt in any of our minds that we will be louder and stronger in the face of anyone who wants to hate. So thank you. The chat is open up, so feel free for questions. Question that says, was it openly known that being on Schindler's work list would save you?
Meaning at the time, probably not, but it definitely was a better fate than staying in Plaszow. The whole idea was that they knew what was awaiting them where they were, and the chance to go somewhere else was always a chance to survive somewhere else. They saw what was going on in Plaszow around them. And at the time, it seems like maybe the secretary did have some kind of information, or at least some inkling that this might be a good thing. All right, and it definitely was for labor, for work. So it seemed people knew that if you did work, that meant that you would survive. So it definitely was another chance at life, if not anything else.
And Donnie, somebody wants to know where your grandmother went after leaving Auschwitz on the death march.
That's a good question. She wandered around Europe a little bit. Eventually, wound up in France. Again, there's more to the story. Obviously, she also at that time did some work for the Haganah and the Bricha, helping Jews move to Palestine illegally or at Aliyah Bet. And she was in France. She had her first child in France. She was able to get eventually sponsored to go to New York. She had another child in New York, my other uncle. And then she eventually got to LA, where Pearl, her sister, was waiting for her. They settled there. And that's when she had my mother. And that's where she was the rest of her life.
Thank you. Any other questions? Donnie, I have a question about the research for the other stories.
Sure.
What was it like? Obviously, you took your family story and I think beautifully ended with your family story. What was it like doing research for the other stories? As you mentioned, the finding the font about Eli Bao and the other families. Yeah, could you just tell us about the research that you did for each of the stories?
Sure. The truth is that, at least, especially for Joseph Bao, the first time I ever heard of him was actually his daughters run this wacky little museum in Tel Aviv, and they're something else. I see some of my students smiling because we took them there, and they're definitely characters. And the more I heard about Joseph Bao, I just had to know more. And so I bought his book. I read his book, which is a whole other thing just to get inside that man's head. From then, when I wanted to do the story, I wanted to just, try and supplement it with pictures, because Zoom is difficult to teach. Just staring at my mug for 45 minutes could be hard. So I wanted to find some pictures, and the more pictures, the more the story came to life for me. And this is someone who's met his daughters, who's told his stories in Plaszow, but just like, I almost felt like it felt more personal getting these pictures. And the same is true with Ovadia and Eliza Baruch, whose story I've told in Auschwitz I in front of Block 10. I don't know. There was something about the research that made it feel like, maybe because I was doing it with my family story, that it kind of felt like they were all my family, if that makes any sense. Yeah, I don't know. The research became very personal at some point, and I feel like the stories resonated even deeper with me for the first time, and that was kind of cool.
What's the name of the book?
Dear God, Have You Ever Gone Hungry? Yeah, it's available in like 5 different languages. Probably on the internet, I don't know for sure.
Well, I'm going to say again, Donnie, thank you for your beautiful storytelling, your sharing your story of your family with each and every one of us, not just your former students, and we are now part of your student alumni. There's been many applause, as you can see on the Zoom link. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Just a few words. All of our videos, including our class today, can be found on the JNF YouTube page, hopefully by the end of today, if not tomorrow morning. I would invite you to continue to join us at 1 o'clock each and every day with all of our must teachers teaching a different topic that is near and dear to them. Donnie will be back again, I believe, before the end of April.
Yep.
We'll be here tomorrow at 1 o'clock, and then of course we'll be off for the Pesach holiday, and be back next Monday and Tuesday, off for the rest of the week then, and then back the following week. Please, before you log off, please send me an email of GLITCOF as in Frank, SKY. I'm going to do it one more time before we end. It's glitkovsky@amhsi.org. Please send me an email and let us know that you were on the call and how you heard about us, because we would love to continue to spread the word as most efficiently as possible. Donnie, I see your family, you have other family members on the call too. So I want to welcome them from around, I don't know where they are, but from around the world, I'm sure, and how wonderful it is for them to share in this class and these stories with each and every one of us. So Donnie, as always, thank you. Wishing, I'm going to give you, you know what, Donnie, I'm going to stop and give you sort of the last, I know you give us a little nechemt at the end, but I'll stop and give you the last word.
It's tough times. Know that we're going to get through it. We're going to be stronger because that's what we do. And Pesach is the perfect time for us to think about it, internalize it, and come out stronger on the other end. I hope all you guys are happy and healthy and have an amazing Pesach. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.